The encounter at the bus stop. The evening air was sharp, filled with the bite of winter that cut through even the thickest coats. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the orange glow of the street lamps, each one catching the light like tiny sparks before settling onto the ground. The city bus stop stood at the corner of Maple Street, its bench dusted in white, its glass panels scratched and fogged from the cold. A young woman sat hunched on that bench, knees pulled up, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her coat was more of a rag than clothing, torn at the sleeves, thin at the chest, and patched with uneven stitches that told stories of desperation. Strands of golden hair, tangled and heavy with snow, clung to her face. She clutched a faded tote bag so tightly it seemed like it contained her entire life. Her name was Sophie. But no one here knew that. To the people rushing past, she was invisible. Just another shadow among many in the city that didn't stop for broken lives. Her lips were cracked and pale blue, her breath fogging in short, uneven bursts. She hadn't eaten more than a piece of stale bread all day, and her stomach twisted painfully. Still, she curled tighter, as if shrinking would make her hunger easier to bear. Just a few feet away, a man in a dark wool coat stood with his phone pressed to his ear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features softened only by the worried creases on his forehead. His name was Elliot Monroe. He was in his early 30s, dressed neatly for the office job he had just left, his black gloves gripping his phone as he spoke in a low, tense voice. Beside him, holding his other hand, stood a small girl bundled in a pink winter coat, red mittens, and a knitted hat that had a pom-pom bouncing with every little move she made. Her eyes were wide and curious, and her breath came out in excited puffs. She was only 4 years old, but there was something unshakably warm about her presence. Her name was Laia. The bus hadn't come yet, and Elliot's attention was on his call, something about a late project deadline, his voice carrying hints of frustration. But Laia's gaze was fixed elsewhere. She had spotted Sophie. The little girl tilted her head, studying the stranger on the bench. Most people didn't look twice, but children have a way of seeing what adults overlook. And what Laia saw wasn't just a tired woman. She saw loneliness, a quiet sadness that tugged at her young heart. Laia let go of her father's hand, unnoticed, and toddled toward the bench. Her boots crunched softly against the snow. Sophie didn't stir at first. She was used to people ignoring her, but then a tiny pair of mittens gently pressed onto her lap. Sophie's eyes opened slowly, sluggish from exhaustion, and she blinked. On her lap sat a bear-shaped cookie, wrapped carefully in a napkin, and standing before her was the little girl, her face glowing with innocence. "You need a home," Laia said softly, her voice like a whisper between falling snowflakes. Then, with the unshakable conviction only a child could carry, she added, "And I need a mommy." The word struck Sophie like a sudden blow. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Elliot's head snapped up. "Laia!" he exclaimed, ending his call in a rush. He strode over, pulling his daughter gently but firmly back from the stranger. His protective instincts roared to life. He knelt beside his little girl, positioning himself between her and the woman on the bench. "Miss," Elliot said firmly, his voice carrying the edge of suspicion, "what are you doing with my daughter?" Sophie's head shook quickly, her trembling hands rising into the air, palms open. "Nothing," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I didn't touch her, she just came over." Elliot's sharp eyes scanned her. He noticed her skin was flushed too red in odd places, her lips pale from cold. She shivered visibly, clutching the worn tote tighter against herself. "I didn't ask for anything," she murmured, lowering her gaze to the ground. "But thank you for having such a kind child." Laia peered up at her father, her big brown eyes confused. "Daddy, she didn't do anything," she said softly. "She just looks sad." Elliot sighed, torn between his daughter's innocence and his own instincts. Laia tugged at his sleeve. "She gave her cookie to the kitty first," she added proudly, as if that explained everything. Elliot frowned, following her gesture. Near the edge of the bench in the snow, a half-torn bread roll lay scattered. A scraggly, trembling stray cat pawed at the crumbs, licking desperately. The other half was clearly gone. The truth settled in Elliot's chest like a heavy stone. This woman had given half her bread to a starving cat. and his daughter, with her boundless heart, had offered her only cookie in return. For a moment, the world seemed unbearably quiet. Just snow falling, the faint hum of streetlights, and three souls standing on the edge of something they didn't yet understand. Sophie pulled her coat tighter, as if ashamed of her own presence. She whispered again, "I don't want trouble. Please, just let me be." But Leia wouldn't let go of her mitten's grip on Sophie's knee. "Daddy," she said with a firm little voice that made Elliot pause, "can't we help her?" A stranger in the warmth. The night bus rumbled away into the distance, leaving behind a gust of cold wind that seemed to cut straight through the bones. Elliot stood at the corner with his daughter's hand in one glove and his briefcase in the other, still debating silently with himself. He had been raised to believe in responsibility, in protecting what you already had rather than reaching into someone else's chaos, but the sight of Sophie, shivering, her breath clouding in weak bursts, gnawed at him like a persistent ache. He had seen homelessness before, but there was something about her presence, about the raw fragility in her posture, that refused to leave his conscience. And Leia, with her fearless innocence, stood looking up at him, eyes brimming with the kind of hope only a child could hold. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "She can't stay here all night. It's too cold. She'll get sick." Elliot exhaled, his breath misting. He crouched down to meet his daughter's gaze, brushing a loose curl from beneath her knitted cap. "Sweetheart," he said carefully, choosing words that balanced honesty and caution, "we don't know her. We don't know if she's safe. It isn't that simple." But Leia shook her head with quiet determination. "It is simple. She's alone, and we're not. Mommy isn't here, but maybe she can sit with us, just for tonight." The way she said it, with a mix of longing and conviction, pierced deeper than Elliot expected. He looked back at Sophie, who sat silently, head bowed as though she wished the snow would bury her. Her hands clutched that tote bag tighter, as if inside it lay not just scraps but her last connection to dignity. When Elliot's eyes lingered too long, Sophie raised her face slightly, her pale blue eyes catching the dim light. They weren't pleading. No, they carried the weight of someone too tired to beg, too proud to ask, but silently aware that survival depended on the kindness of strangers. Elliot sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Everything in him screamed caution. Yet another part whispered that ignoring her was the greater risk, the risk of teaching his daughter that compassion had limits, that they should walk past suffering if it was inconvenient. He wasn't sure he could bear that lesson. "Miss," he said finally, his voice softer now, "do you have anywhere else to go tonight?" Sophie shook her head faintly. "No," she whispered, her voice raw. "But you don't have to worry. I won't bother you. I'll manage." "Manage?" Elliot echoed, glancing at her thin coat, the snow already clinging to her shoulders. "Out here?" His tone carried disbelief, but Sophie only tightened her arms around herself, as if she would rather freeze than impose. Leia broke the silence with the boldness only a child could carry. She tugged her father's sleeve again and declared, "She's coming with us. We have hot cocoa and a blanket, and we can share." Elliot almost smiled at his daughter's unwavering certainty, though the situation was anything but light. He turned to Sophie once more. "It's just for one night," he said cautiously. "You can come in, warm up, get some food, that's all. Tomorrow, you figure out your next steps." For a long moment, Sophie didn't move. Then, with trembling fingers, she pushed herself upright. The tote bag slipped from her lap and she caught it quickly, clutching it close. Her knees wobbled slightly, as though standing took more strength than she had left. She looked at Elliot as if searching for hidden judgment in his eyes, but all she found was guarded caution. Slowly, she gave the faintest nod. The walk to Elliot's home was quiet, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow and Leia's cheerful humming as she skipped between them. Sophie walked half a step behind, her shoulders tense, as if expecting at any moment to be told she was unwell. "Come." The neighborhood streets grew quieter as they turned into the small lane where Elliot's townhouse stood, an unassuming brick building with warm light spilling from the windows, promising comfort. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, a remnant of the holiday season. The heater purred gently, filling the space with warmth that immediately made Sophie's eyes sting. She had forgotten what it felt like to step into a room where the air didn't bite. She paused just inside the doorway, afraid her boots would dirty the neat rug, until Leia ran back, tugging her hand with surprising confidence. "Come on," the little girl insisted. "You can sit on the couch. I'll get the cocoa." Elliot closed the door behind them, watching the scene unfold with silent apprehension. He set down his briefcase, slipped off his coat, and kept one eye on Sophie. She lingered in the entryway, clutching her tote, gaze darting nervously across the framed photographs on the wall. Smiling pictures of Leia at the park, holiday gatherings, moments of joy frozen in time. Sophie's lips parted slightly as though she had stumbled into a museum of a life she once dreamed of but lost along the way. Elliot cleared his throat, offering a small gesture toward the living room. "You can sit down. Take your boots off if you like. I'll get you something warm." Sophie hesitated, then moved with quiet steps to the edge of the couch. She perched there gingerly, as if the cushions might reject her weight. Her tote stayed on her lap, clutched tightly. She said nothing, though her eyes flicked once toward Leia, who was bustling in the kitchen with more energy than coordination, trying to reach the cocoa tin. A few minutes later, Elliot returned with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to Sophie. She took it carefully, fingers trembling as they closed around the warmth. The first sip made her eyes flutter shut for a moment, as if her body barely remembered what comfort felt like. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't just gratitude for the drink, it was gratitude for being seen. Leia hopped onto the couch beside her, holding her own mug. "See?" she chirped. "Better than snow." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched Sophie's lips. It was faint, fragile, but real. "Yes," she murmured. "Much better." Elliot sat across from them, his expression thoughtful. He still didn't trust her. He couldn't, not with his daughter's safety on the line. But as he watched Sophie cradling the mug with both hands, shoulders trembling not just from cold but from the weight of exhaustion, he felt the tension inside him shift. This wasn't a con artist or a threat. This was someone broken, someone who had fallen through the cracks. And for reasons he couldn't explain, his daughter had chosen to reach into those cracks and pull her closer. That night, Sophie lay on the couch with a blanket Leia insisted on tucking around her. She didn't protest, though shame gnawed at her. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a household at rest, and let the warmth seep into her bones. For the first time in months, she felt her guard loosen, though she whispered to herself that it was only temporary. One night. Just one. But in the next room, Leia whispered to her father with sleepy certainty, "She's going to stay, Daddy. I just know it." Elliot kissed his daughter's forehead, murmuring something non-committal. Yet deep down, he feared that his little girl was right, that this was not the end, but only the beginning of something none of them had planned for. Healing wounds, the morning Sioux, unstreamed through the thin curtains of the Monroe household, painting the living room in pale gold. For Sophie, the sensation of waking in warmth rather than the biting cold of an outdoor bench felt almost unreal. She opened her eyes slowly, the soft weight of a borrowed blanket wrapped around her like a shield against the world. For a few seconds she didn't move, afraid that any sudden gesture might shatter this fragile moment, as if the warmth itself might vanish and reveal the cruel reality she had known for too long. The faint hum of the heater, the smell of coffee drifting faintly from the kitchen, and the quiet murmur of Elliot speaking to Leia blended together in a symphony of normalcy that Sophie had long been exiled from. She sat up slowly, fingers tightening around her tote bag, which she had kept clutched to her chest even in sleep. Inside were nothing of material value, some worn clothes, a battered notebook, a few photographs bent from years of being handled, and scraps that only she understood as treasures. It was her life reduced to fabric and paper, and she couldn't imagine letting it out of her sight, not even here. She smoothed the blanket nervously, glancing toward the kitchen where father and daughter moved with a rhythm that looked like a dance of routine. Leia's little laughter bubbled like a song, while Elliot's deep voice guided her through the simple act of setting the table. Sophie rose carefully, still feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. Every step on the carpet felt as though she was trespassing, though no one had told her so. When Leia spotted her, the child's face brightened instantly. "Good morning," she chirped, rushing over with a spoon still in her mitten-sized hand. "You slept. Daddy says breakfast is the most important meal. Come sit." The innocent invitation tugged at something deep inside Sophie, a place that had long been cold and neglected. She nodded faintly, whispering, "Good morning," as though her voice might disturb the fragile perfection of the moment. Elliot looked up, his eyes scanning her with the same measured caution as the night before. He gave a small nod, not unfriendly, but not quite welcoming either. "There's coffee if you want, and oatmeal, nothing fancy but warm." His words carried a balance between kindness and boundaries, a reminder that while she was allowed here for now, it was not permanent. Sophie hesitated, but the rumble of her stomach betrayed her, and she murmured a quiet thank you before sliding into the chair Leia pulled out eagerly for her. The steam from the oatmeal bowl curled upward, carrying the scent of cinnamon and sugar, and Sophie had to blink quickly to hide the sudden sting in her eyes. She picked up the spoon, her hands trembling slightly, and tasted the first bite. It was simple, nothing extraordinary, but to someone who had spent weeks relying on stale bread and soup from shelters, it felt like a feast. Leia watched her closely, chin propped on her tiny fists, eyes wide with the joy of sharing. "Do you like it?" she asked, as though Sophie's answer meant everything. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. "It's wonderful," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you." The child's smile grew even brighter, and she leaned across the table, whispering conspiratorially, "See, Daddy? I told you she'd like it." Elliot gave a faint smile despite himself, shaking his head slightly. He wanted to maintain distance, to keep perspective, but there was no denying the effect Sophie had on his daughter. Leia had been happy before, yes, but there was something different now, something deeper, a sense of purpose in her small gestures of kindness, as though bringing sops. He into their world had given her a mission her young heart craved. The day unfolded slowly, with Sophie remaining quiet, always careful not to overstep. She lingered on the edges, offering to wash the dishes, folding the blanket she had used, keeping her space neat as though proving silently that she did not intend to take advantage. Yet despite her efforts to remain invisible, Leia tugged her into every corner of the day, asking her to read a picture book aloud, to help color a drawing, to join her in watching cartoons on the living room floor. At first Sophie resisted, shaking her head, murmuring that she shouldn't, but the child's persistence wore through her hesitation. Soon, Sophie found herself reading softly, her voice rusty but growing stronger as Leia leaned against her side, eyes glued to the pages. Elliot observed from the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It was strange, watching this fragile stranger who had appeared from nowhere blend so seamlessly into his daughter's world. He felt both uneasy and strangely at peace, two emotions that warred silently inside him. That evening, as the sky turned violet and snowflakes drifted again against the windows, Sophie found herself standing near the bookshelf. Among the rows of neatly arranged novels and picture books, a framed photograph caught her attention. It showed Elliot with a woman whose smile mirrored Leia's, her arm wrapped lovingly around both father and child. The woman's hair shone dark under the sunlight captured in the picture, her eyes filled with a warmth that made Sophie's chest tighten. She realized instantly who it was, Leia's mother. Elliot entered the room then, pausing when he saw her gaze fixed on the photo. Their eyes met, and Sophie quickly looked down, guilt flushing her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I shouldn't have." "It's fine," Elliot said quietly, his voice carrying a heaviness that spoke of wounds not yet healed. He stepped closer, his eyes softening as he looked at the picture himself. Her name was Anna. She passed away 2 years ago. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the heater. Sophie swallowed, her hands tightening around the strap of her tote. She wanted to speak, to offer sympathy, but words felt clumsy in her mouth. Instead, she whispered, "She looks kind." "She was," Elliot replied simply, his jaw tightening as though the memory both warmed and pained him. Then he turned towards Sophie, his tone shifting to one of gentle caution. I appreciate you being kind to Leia, but you should understand, she's been through enough. I won't let anyone hurt her again, not even by accident. The words, though softly spoken, cut deep into Sophie's heart. She nodded quickly, eyes cast down, shame pressing heavily on her shoulders. She wanted to say she would never dream of hurting the child, but she knew promises from someone like her, homeless, broken, carried little weight. Instead, she whispered, I understand. That night, when the house grew quiet again, Sophie lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling with eyes wide open. Memories she had tried to bury rose unbidden, her own childhood, her mother's absence, the choices that had led her here, the betrayals that had left her stranded. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, whispering into the silence, Don't get used to this. Don't get comfortable. Yet even as she said it, she felt the faint warmth of Leia's tiny hand still curled around hers from earlier, and for the first time in years, Sophie allowed herself to wonder if healing was possible. The test of trust. The days that followed were a mixture of warmth and unease, like stepping into a house where one window had been left open to the winter air. Sophie tried to remain invisible, moving carefully around Elliot's home, never touching more than what was offered, always tidying after herself as though she were a guest walking on glass. She folded the blankets neatly every morning, washed every dish she used, and kept her tote bag clutched close to her side as if it were her passport to existence. Yet despite her efforts to keep distance, the natural rhythm of the household slowly pulled her into its orbit. Leia refused to let her hide. The little girl's laughter echoed through the house whenever Sophie read to her, played board games, or braided her hair with fingers that trembled at first but grew steadier with practice. Each evening, Leia's small hands would tug Sophie to the couch, insisting that she sit with them during family time, as though she had always belonged there. Sophie found herself smiling more often, though she caught those smiles quickly, afraid of what hope could do to someone like her. But while Leia embraced Sophie without hesitation, Elliot remained cautious. His gratitude for Sophie's kindness to his daughter wrestled with his unease about letting a stranger into his home. His eyes followed her movements with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent years protecting what mattered most, and his heart whispered warnings even as his daughter's happiness tugged him in the opposite direction. He wanted to believe Sophie was harmless, but trust for Elliot was not given. It was earned slowly, like bricks stacked carefully into a wall. The tension reached its first breaking point one cold Saturday morning. Elliot had stepped out briefly to shovel the walkway, leaving Sophie and Leia in the kitchen. Leia had been showing Sophie her favorite coloring book, insisting she join in. Sophie leaned across the table, a rare smile on her face, when Elliot re-entered the house, bobbed, rushing snow from his coat. He placed his wallet and keys on the counter as he always did, a habit of routine. The three of them moved into the living room for a while, but when Elliot returned later, the wallet was gone. His heart froze. He checked the counter again, then the table, then the floor. His pulse quickened as he retraced his steps, his mind instantly sharpening with suspicion. His eyes flicked toward Sophie, who sat curled on the couch with her tote bag in her lap, her hands clenched around it like a lifeline. "Has anyone seen my wallet?" Elliot asked, his voice deceptively calm but carrying an edge that made the air heavy. Leia shook her head, too busy with her crayons to notice the shift. Sophie, however, stiffened, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. Elliot's gaze locked onto her, suspicion plain in his eyes. I haven't," Sophie stammered, her voice low. She shifted slightly, clutching the tote even tighter, and the movement was all Elliot needed to confirm the darkest thought that had sparked in his mind. "Can I see your bag?" His words were blunt, the kind that cut without intention. The color drained from Sophie's face. She shook her head quickly, almost violently. "No." That one word was enough to widen the rift. Elliot's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. He stepped forward, voice dropping into the firm tone of a man used to protecting his own. "If you didn't take it, then you have nothing to hide." Sophie's hands trembled, her eyes darting between him and Leia, who had finally looked up, her small face confused. "It's all I have," Sophie whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Everything, please, don't." "Then show me," Elliot pressed, his patience thinning, his suspicion now blazing. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sophie's body trembled as she hugged the tote closer, her lips quivering. In her eyes, Elliot didn't just see a defensive woman, he saw someone cornered, someone carrying scars that had nothing to do with wallets and everything to do with survival. Still, fear for his daughter's safety overpowered his compassion. But before the confrontation could escalate further, Leia piped up in her small, innocent voice, "Daddy, I saw it." Both adults turned toward her in stunned silence. The little girl pointed to the side table near the front door, where Elliot's wallet sat tucked beneath the morning mail. "You put it there when you came in, see?" Elliot froze, his face flushing hot with shame. He strode quickly to the table, and sure enough, the wallet sat exactly where his daughter pointed. He picked it up slowly, guilt washing over him like a tide. Sophie sat rigid on the couch, her eyes brimming with tears that threatened to spill. She didn't say anything, but the hurt was plain on her face. The pain of being accused, of being seen as untrustworthy simply because of who she was and where she had come from. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she pulled her tote tighter and rose to her feet. "I should go," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't belong here." Leia gasped, dropping her crayons and running to Sophie, wrapping her little arms around her waist. "No, don't go. Daddy made a mistake. He didn't mean it. Please stay." Her eyes brimmed with tears as she clung desperately to the woman she had begun to see as more than a guest, more than a stranger. The three of them moved into the living room for a while, but when Elliot returned later, the wallet was gone. His heart froze. He checked the counter again, then the table, then the floor. His pulse quickened as he retraced his steps, his mind instantly sharpening with suspicion. His eyes flicked toward Sophie, who sat curled on the couch with her tote bag in her lap, her hands clenched around it like a lifeline. "Has anyone seen my wallet?" Elliot asked, his voice deceptively calm but carrying an edge that made the air heavy. Leia shook her head, too busy with her crayons to notice the shift. Sophie, however, stiffened, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. Elliot's gaze locked onto her, suspicion plain in his eyes. I haven't," Sophie stammered, her voice low. She shifted slightly, clutching the tote even tighter, and the movement was all Elliot needed to confirm the darkest thought that had sparked in his mind. "Can I see your bag?" His words were blunt, the kind that cut without intention. The color drained from Sophie's face. She shook her head quickly, almost violently. "No." That one word was enough to widen the rift. Elliot's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. He stepped forward, voice dropping into the firm tone of a man used to protecting his own. "If you didn't take it, then you have nothing to hide." Sophie's hands trembled, her eyes darting between him and Leia, who had finally looked up, her small face confused. "It's all I have," Sophie whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Everything. Please, don't." "Then show me," Elliot pressed, his patience thinning, his suspicion now blazing. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sophie's body trembled as she hugged the tote closer, her lips quivering. In her eyes, Elliot didn't just see a defensive woman. He saw someone cornered, someone carrying scars that had nothing to do with wallets and everything to do with survival. Still, fear for his daughter's safety overpowered his compassion. But before the confrontation could escalate further, Leia piped up in her small, innocent voice, "Daddy, I saw it." Both adults turned toward her in stunned silence. The little girl pointed to the side table near the front door where Elliot's wallet sat tucked beneath the morning mail. "You put it there when you came in, see?" Elliot froze, his face flushing hot with shame. He strode quickly to the table and sure enough, the wallet sat exactly where his daughter pointed. He picked it up slowly, guilt washing over him like a tide. Sophie sat rigid on the couch, her eyes brimming with tears that threatened to spill. She didn't say anything, but the hurt was plain on her face. The pain of being accused, of being seen as untrustworthy simply because of who she was and where she had come from. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, she pulled her tote tighter and rose to her feet. "I should go," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't belong here." Leia gasped, dropping her crayons and running to Sophie, wrapping her little arms around her waist. "No, don't go. Daddy made a mistake. He didn't mean it. Please stay." Her eyes brimmed with tears as she clung desperately to the woman she had begun to see as more than a guest, more than a stranger. Elliot stood frozen, his guilt battling his pride. He wanted to apologize, but the words tangled in his throat. He wanted to explain his fears, his need to protect his daughter, but the image of Sophie's tear-filled eyes silenced him. For the first time, he realized that trust wasn't only about keeping danger out, it was also about giving someone a chance to prove themselves, and he had just failed that test. The room was silent except for Leia's muffled sobs as she clung to Sophie. Slowly, with trembling hands, Sophie bent down and held the little girl, her own tears falling freely now. She whispered something soft into Leia's hair, words Elliot couldn't hear, but the tone was filled with raw honesty, the kind that carried both love and pain. It was in that moment, watching them together, that Elliot felt the shift. His fear had blinded him, but the truth was plain. This fragile woman who had stumbled into their lives was not a threat. She was someone broken, yes, but someone whose soul still carried gentleness even after everything. And his daughter, with her pure heart, had seen that truth from the very beginning. Outside, neighbors passed by, their eyes peeking through curtains, whispers already beginning to stir. Some wondered why Elliot had taken in a homeless woman. Others judged quietly, shaking their heads. Gossip traveled faster than snowflakes in the wind. But inside that house, a different kind of storm brewed, a storm of mistrust, guilt, and the possibility of forgiveness. That night, Sophie remained on the couch, though her sleep was restless. Elliot lingered in the hallway, watching her with silent remorse. He knew he would have to make things right, not only for Sophie, but for the daughter who believed in her so fiercely. Because sometimes trust wasn't about waiting for proof. Sometimes it was about choosing to see the truth in someone even when the world refused to. Rising from the shadows, the days after the misunderstanding about the wallet passed like heavy clouds refusing to move. Sophie carried herself more carefully than ever, her voice quieter, her presence almost ghost-like as she lingered at the edges of the Monroe household. Though Elliot had apologized, his voice low and his words halting, she had accepted with a nod, but not with her heart. The wound of being suspected, of having her dignity questioned so quickly, still pulsed beneath the surface. Yet what surprised her most was not Elliot's suspicion, but Leia's unwavering trust. The little girl clung to her more tightly than before, insisting on sitting beside her during meals, tugging her hand to join in games, whispering in her ear as though Sophie were her secret confidant. That trust, fragile yet unshakable, was the thread that kept Sophie from packing her few belongings and vanishing back into the cold. Each morning, Sophie rose early before Elliot left for work and busied herself with quiet tasks, folding laundry, scrubbing dishes, organizing the clutter of toys scattered across the floor. She never asked permission, never drew attention, but she wanted to show her gratitude in actions rather than words. She wanted to prove, if only to herself, that she was more than the broken figure Elliot had first seen at the bus stop. But with each passing day, the itch of restlessness grew stronger. It wasn't enough to exist under someone else's roof. She needed to rebuild, to carve a path that was hers, or else she would drown in the feeling of being a burden. It was Leia who first planted the seed of change. One afternoon, she came running into the living room holding a coloring page covered in bright crayons. "Look," she cried, thrusting it into Sophie's hands. The page showed a crooked house with smoke curling from its chimney, a stick-figure girl holding hands with another figure beside her. Above them, in clumsy, uneven letters, Leia had written, "My family." Sophie stared at the drawing until her throat tightened, her vision blurring with tears. She tried to blink away. She wanted to say something, to explain that she wasn't family, that she couldn't stay, but the words withered in her mouth. Leia's innocent smile silenced her, and for the first time, Sophie wondered if she could truly become the figure in that picture, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. Later that evening, Elliot came home to find Sophie seated at the dining table, papers spread before her. He frowned slightly, unused to seeing her engaged in anything beyond housework. "What's that?" he asked, hanging up his coat. Sophie looked up, startled, then lowered her gaze again. Job listings, she murmured. I thought I should try. I can't stay here forever. I need to stand on my own. Elliot studied her for a long moment, conflicted. Part of him admired her determination. Another part feared what would happen if she stepped out into the world too quickly, too fragile. Do you have experience, he asked cautiously. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pen she held. I used to work in an office, receptionist, scheduling, small bookkeeping tasks, before. Her voice trailed off, the weight of unspoken memories pressing down. She shook her head as if brushing them away. It's been years. I don't know if anyone would even give me a chance now. Elliot walked closer, leaning against the counter as he crossed his arms. You won't know until you try, he said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the bluntness of truth. But if you're serious, I can help. I know a few people who might at least look at your resume. The word resume felt like a foreign tongue to Sophie, but the offer sent a flicker of light through the gloom she carried. She nodded faintly, whispering, Thank you. In the days that followed, Sophie threw herself into preparation. She dusted off her old notebook, piecing together scraps of her past work experience. Elliot lent her his laptop in the evenings, guiding her through job applications with a patient but firm hand. He corrected her phrasing, encouraged her to be honest but confident, and occasionally reminded her to stop doubting herself with every line she typed. Slowly, Sophie's self-image began to shift. She was no longer only the homeless woman at the bus stop. She was someone with skills, with value, with the possibility of a future. Yet not everyone saw it that way. The neighbors had begun to talk. Whispers floated through the quiet street, glances lingered longer than necessary when Sophie accompanied Leah to the corner park. Some mothers pulled their children a little closer, their smiles polite but stiff. At the grocery store, Sophie overheard two women near the produce aisle, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. Did you hear? Elliot Monroe took in some homeless woman, a stranger, right into his house. Poor Leah, imagine. The risk. You never know what people like that are capable of. Sophie froze where she stood, clutching the basket in her hands until her knuckles turned white. Shame burned in her chest, hotter than the furnace at Elliot's home. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. But then she felt Leah's small hand slip into hers, tugging her gently. The little girl looked up at her with complete trust, oblivious to the poison in the air. That simple touch reminded Sophie why she was enduring the whispers at all, because for the first time in years, someone truly believed in her. That night, when the house was quiet, Sophie sat awake on the couch, staring at her hands. The voices of the neighbors echoed in her head, blending with memories of her past failures, her family's disappointment, her own mistakes. But alongside those voices came another, the innocent certainty of a child who had once said, "You need a home, and I need a mommy." That phrase had lodged itself in Sophie's heart like a seed, and no amount of cold gossip could root it out. She realized then that if she wanted to rise from the shadows of her past, it wouldn't be enough to survive. She would have to fight, not with fists, but with persistence, with resilience, with the courage to keep stepping forward even when the world whispered behind her back. When Elliot found her still awake, papers spread across the table once more, he didn't scold her for losing sleep. Instead, he set down a steaming mug of tea beside her and said quietly, "You're stronger than you think. Don't let them make you forget it." Sophie met his gaze, startled by the unexpected softness in his tone. For the first time, she saw not just caution in his eyes, but respect beginning to take root. It was a small shift, but to Sophie, it felt like the first step on a bridge she had long believed impossible to cross. And deep inside, though she barely dared to admit it, she began to wonder if the picture Leah had drawn of a family with her hand in theirs might one day become more than just a child's fantasy. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pen she held. I used to work in an office, receptionist, scheduling, small bookkeeping tasks, before. Her voice trailed off, the weight of unspoken memories pressing down. She shook her head as if brushing them away. It's been years. I don't know if anyone would even give me a chance now. Elliot walked closer, leaning against the counter as he crossed his arms. You won't know until you try, he said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the bluntness of truth. "But if you're serious, I can help. I know a few people who might at least look at your resume." The word resume felt like a foreign tongue to Sophie, but the offer sent a flicker of light through the gloom she carried. She nodded faintly, whispering, "Thank you." In the days that followed, Sophie threw herself into preparation. She dusted off her old notebook, piecing together scraps of her past work experience. Elliot lent her his laptop in the evenings, guiding her through job applications with a patient but firm hand. He corrected her phrasing, encouraged her to be honest but confident, and occasionally reminded her to stop doubting herself with every line she typed. Slowly, Sophie's self-image began to shift. She was no longer only the homeless woman at the bus stop. She was someone with skills, with value, with the possibility of a future. Yet not everyone saw it that way. The neighbors had begun to talk. Whispers floated through the quiet street, glances lingered longer than necessary when Sophie accompanied Leah to the corner park. Some mothers pulled their children a little closer, their smiles polite but stiff. At the grocery store, Sophie overheard two women near the produce aisle, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. "Did you hear? Elliot Monroe took in some homeless woman, a stranger, right into his house. Poor Leah, imagine. The risk. You never know what people like that are capable of." Sophie froze where she stood, clutching the basket in her hands until her knuckles turned white. Shame burned in her chest, hotter than the furnace at Elliot's home. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. But then she felt Leah's small hand slip into hers, tugging her gently. The little girl looked up at her with complete trust, oblivious to the poison in the air. That simple touch reminded Sophie why she was enduring the whispers at all, because for the first time in years, someone truly believed in her. That night, when the house was quiet, Sophie sat awake on the couch, staring at her hands. The voices of the neighbors echoed in her head, blending with memories of her past failures, her family's disappointment, her own mistakes. But alongside those voices came another, the innocent certainty of a child who had once said, "You need a home, and I need a mommy." That phrase had lodged itself in Sophie's heart like a seed, and no amount of cold gossip could root it out. She realized then that if she wanted to rise from the shadows of her past, it wouldn't be enough to survive. She would have to fight, not with fists, but with persistence, with resilience, with the courage to keep stepping forward even when the world whispered behind her back. When Elliot found her still awake, papers spread across the table once more, he didn't scold her for losing sleep. Instead, he set down a steaming mug of tea beside her and said quietly, "You're stronger than you think. Don't let them make you forget it." Sophie met his gaze, startled by the unexpected softness in his tone. For the first time, she saw not just caution in his eyes, but respect beginning to take root. It was a small shift, but to Sophie, it felt like the first step on a bridge she had long believed impossible to cross. And deep inside, though she barely dared to admit it, she began to wonder if the picture Leah had drawn of a family with her hand in theirs might one day become more than just a child's fantasy, the breaking point and revelation. Winter had deepened by the time Sophie received her first call back from a job application. The day had begun like any other, with Elliot leaving early for the office and Leah bouncing with energy at the thought of preschool crafts. But the phone ringing that afternoon had shifted everything. Sophie stared at the screen in disbelief, her heart racing as a polite voice on the other end invited her for an interview at a local clinic that needed a receptionist. It was nothing glamorous, nothing like the career she once dreamed of, but to Sophie it felt monumental. A door had cracked open, and all she had to do was gather the courage to step through. When Elliot returned that evening, Sophie told him nervously over dinner. She expected hesitation, perhaps a reminder not to rush, but instead, his face softened into something that surprised her. Pride. "That's good, Sophie," he said firmly, nodding as though sealing the words into truth. "You've worked for this. You should go." For the first time since they had met, she felt he saw her not as a burden, not as a shadow, but as a woman trying to rise again. But with new light came new shadows. It happened on a Thursday evening when Sophie was walking back from the small grocery shop, arms laden with a bag of simple essentials she had bought with money Elliot had insisted she use. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and the air carried the heavy silence of a neighborhood settling for the night. She turned the corner toward the townhouse, heart light with anticipation to tell Leah about the colorful cereal she had picked out, when a voice, sharp, mocking, and painfully familiar, cut through the quiet. Well, if it isn't little Sophie. The sound rooted her to the spot. Her breath caught, her grip on the grocery bag tightening until the thin plastic cut into her fingers. She turned slowly, and there he was, Darren, a man from her past, someone she had prayed never to see again. His clothes were ragged, but his eyes still carried that cruel gleam, the kind that thrived on others' weakness. Once, years ago, she had trusted him. Once he had promised to help when she fell on hard times, but instead he had dragged her deeper, feeding off her desperation until she had nothing left. "Didn't expect to see you living in a nice neighborhood," Darren sneered, stepping closer. "Who'd you trick this time? Some poor sap who doesn't know what you are?" His words slashed like knives, each syllable slicing through the fragile strength Sophie had been building. She tried to move past him, whispering, "Leave me alone," but he blocked her path, his grin widening. "You always did run, Sophie, but you can't run from the truth. You're nothing. And sooner or later, they'll see it too. That man, that little girl, they'll find out who you really are. Then where will you go?" Her chest tightened, panic surging as old memories crashed back. Shelters she had fled, debts she couldn't pay, promises broken not by malice but by the crushing weight of survival. She pushed past him finally, her legs trembling as she hurried the last block to Elliot's home, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't realize she was crying until she shut the door behind her and sank to the floor, the groceries spilling around her. Elliot appeared instantly, his face etched with alarm as he knelt beside her. "Sophie, what happened?" She shook her head violently, trying to steady her breath, but the fear wouldn't loosen its grip. Leah ran from the living room, her eyes wide, her tiny hands reaching to touch Sophie's arm. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Someone from before. He saw me. He knows where I am." The words tumbled up, but heavy with dread. "Any promises?" Elliot's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. He wanted details, names, explanations, but one look at Sophie's tear-streaked face silenced his questions. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, guiding her gently to the couch. "You're safe here," he said firmly, though his own mind churned with doubts. Safe was a word easier said than proven. That night, after Leah had been tucked into bed, Elliot confronted Sophie gently but directly. "You need to tell me what happened," he urged. "If there are people who might hurt you, or worse, hurt my daughter, I need to know." Sophie's hands twisted in her lap, her body rigid with shame. She wanted to stay silent, to bury her past where no one could dig it up. But the look in Elliot's eyes, the mixture of fear for his child and a fragile thread of trust in her, forced the truth from her lips. She told him about Darren, about the choices she had made when desperation cornered her, about the debts and dangers that had chased her into the streets. She spoke haltingly, her voice cracking, but she did not hide. When she finished, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Elliot leaned back, exhaling slowly, his face unreadable. The truth weighed on him, reshaping his image of the woman who had come into his home. He saw her flaws now, the cracks in her story, but he also saw the courage it took to confess them. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, but honesty was the first stone laid. Sophie lowered her gaze, whispering, "If you want me to leave, I will. I don't want to bring trouble into your life, into Leah's life." For a long moment, Elliot said nothing. Then, to Sophie's shock, he shook his head. "No, you've made mistakes, but you're here now. You're trying. That matters more to me than what came before." His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the storm beneath. Fear, doubt, and something else she couldn't name yet. It was Leah, once again, who sealed the moment. The little girl had crept from her room, rubbing her sleepy eyes, and stood in the doorway listening. She padded across the floor and climbed onto Sophie's lap, curling against her chest with innocent certainty. "You don't have to go," she murmured. You're my mommy now. Mommies don't leave." The words struck like lightning, cutting through every layer of fear and shame Sophie carried. Tears spilled freely as she wrapped her arms around the child, holding her close as though she were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Elliot's chest tightened at the sight, his doubts colliding with the undeniable truth before him. His daughter didn't just want Sophie here, she needed her. That night marked the breaking point. Sophie could no longer hide from her past, and Elliot could no longer pretend she was only a guest passing through. Their lives had entangled, their futures bound in ways none of them had intended. And as Sophie finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, Elliot sat awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the real question was no longer whether Sophie belonged in their lives, but whether he was brave enough to fight for her place in it. A new family, a new beginning. The weeks after Sophie's confession were some of the most difficult she had ever faced. Each day felt like standing on the edge of a fragile bridge, uncertain if it would hold or collapse under her weight. Elliot remained cautious, his trust still rebuilding, but his actions began to reveal a quiet loyalty that his words did not always carry. He made sure Darren never came near their street, walking Sophie to and from her interview when she felt uneasy. He checked the locks each night, not just for his daughter's safety, but for Sophie's peace of mind. It was a silent protection, the kind that spoke, louder than any promises. A new family, a new beginning. The weeks after Sophie's confession were some of the most difficult she had ever faced. Each day felt like standing on the edge of a fragile bridge, uncertain if it would hold or collapse under her weight. Elliot remained cautious, his trust still rebuilding, but his actions began to reveal a quiet loyalty that his words did not always carry. He made sure Darren never came near their street, walking Sophie to and from her interview when she felt uneasy. He checked the locks each night, not just for his daughter's safety, but for Sophie's peace of mind. It was a silent protection, the kind that spoke louder than any promises. Sophie herself felt transformed by the moment of honesty. For years she had carried her past like chains, burying her mistakes beneath silence and shame. But now that they had been spoken aloud, now that Elliot knew and had not cast her out, she found a strange strength stirring inside her. She could not erase where she had been, but she could choose where she was going. That realization fueled her steps as she walked nervously into the clinic for her interview. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, its walls lined with health posters and filing cabinets. Sophie sat across from the manager, hands folded tightly in her lap, and answered questions with honesty she had once feared to give. She spoke of her past work, of her time away, of her willingness to start again from the bottom. Her voice trembled at times, but she did not falter. And when the manager leaned back with a small smile and said, "We believe in giving second chances here. You're hired," Sophie nearly wept right there in the chair. When she came home and shared the news, Leah squealed with joy, throwing her arms around Sophie's waist. "I told you," the little girl cried, her voice ringing with triumph. "I told you you could do it. Now you can buy your own cocoa and cookies and maybe even a dollhouse." Elliot smiled faintly at his daughter's excitement, but his gaze lingered on Sophie. In her eyes, he saw a spark he hadn't noticed before, not just relief, but purpose. Life slowly began to change. Sophie adjusted to her new routine at the clinic, nervous at first but gradually finding confidence. She kept her tasks meticulous, arriving early, leaving late, determined to prove that she was more than her past. Some days were harder than others, whispers from certain coworkers, memories that crept in during quiet moments. But each time she faltered, she remembered Leah's trust and Elliot's steady gaze. Those were the anchors that held her upright. Outside the Monroe household, gossip still trickled through the neighborhood, but Sophie no longer bowed under it. Instead, she met their glances with quiet dignity, her head held higher than before. People began to notice the change, not just in her, but in Elliot and Leah as well. The three of them together radiated something stronger than scandal: resilience, unity, the undeniable glow of a family that had been forged not by blood, but by choice. The true test came one Saturday when Darren reappeared near the park. Sophie froze when she saw him leaning against the fence, his sneer aimed directly at her. Old fear coiled in her chest, but this time she did not run. Instead, she squared her shoulders, Leia's hand clutched firmly in her own, and met his gaze with steady eyes. "You don't get to control me anymore," she said, her voice firm, ringing with a strength she never thought she could carry. "You don't get to decide who I am." Darren scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and slunk away when Elliot stepped up beside her, his stance protective, his eyes sharp as steel. The moment passed quickly, but for Sophie it was monumental. She had faced her past and declared herself free.